I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
Welcome back to another episode of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club. On today's episode, we are going to have a fascinating interview with Paul Haynes, who helped write the I'll Be Gone in the Dark by Michelle McNamara.
Paul Haynes is a Los Angeles-based writer. Known as the Kid in Michelle McNamara's I'll Be Gone in the Dark, Paul worked closely with Michelle as her researcher and investigative partner and helped finish the book after her death. Originally from South Florida, Paul's work with Michelle was the culmination of a decade-long obsession with unsolved serial cases and the Golden State Killer in particular. He has also worked as a film critic, video editor, and screenwriter, and is currently co-executive producing the HBO docuseries of Michelle's book. Welcome, Paul. Can you tell us a little bit about Michelle?
Yeah, so Michelle, I think, was drawn into true crime early in life when she was in high school. There was a girl in her neighborhood, she grew up in Oak Park, suburb of Chicago, who was murdered while jogging. Michelle didn't know this girl, but it was in close enough proximity to her, and they may have had mutual friends that, it haunted her. That was her port of entry into true crime and unsolved murders, specifically unsolved stranger crimes. I think that was Michelle's primary category of interest. And this case, the Golden State Killer, which is a name that Michelle coined. Previously, the offender was known as the East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, had a few different monikers. Just seems like a case that was destined to collide with Michelle. It's a case that just seemed designed for her sensibilities. We first connected in 2011, shortly after her initial piece of writing about this case. I had been doing a lot of work on it independently for no good reason, for no practical objective. A lot of the work we've been doing was similar. Over time, we developed rapport and corresponded pretty much daily for a 2-year period. We had met in 2012. Her father was living in South Florida, which is where I was living and it's where I'm from. She did a piece for Los Angeles Magazine about this case in 2013. It was published, I believe, in April. On the strength of that piece, she sold a book to HarperCollins, which became I'll Be Gone in the Dark.
Now, I hear she had a nickname for you?
The Kid. The Kid is the nickname that she gave me for the LA Magazine piece, and that's what we retained for the book. Now, I'm no longer really a kid. I'm 37 now, although perhaps I should omit numbers at this point. It might be to my advantage. But when we first connected, I was 28, 29. I guess I was relatively younger than a lot of the other people in the true crime sleuthing community. So I guess that was my most distinctive feature at that point, was my youth.
Well, you would still be a kid to me. I have a son that's 37, so...
Okay. I mean, I feel like a kid, for better or worse, and I'll embrace the nickname still.
Well, how is Patton Oswalt dealing with the posthumous fame that Michelle has received?
I can't speak for Patton. It's been challenging for him, as you can imagine. The sudden death of Michelle was devastating for all of us, but most of all for him. And, he was committed to ensuring that this work, Michelle's life work, essentially, was completed to the degree that it could be completed posthumously and released into the world. And I think its success has surprised all of us. Certainly, we expected the book to do well. I believe it's still on the New York Times bestseller list. It has become the second best-selling true crime book of all time. So it's a thrill, but leavened by sadness that Michelle hasn't been able to enjoy it and hasn't been able to enjoy the case being resolved. That's, I think, the saddest part of it.
Yes, definitely.
Now, what role did you and Billy Jensen play in the research for I'll Be Gone in the Dark? And was it a difficult decision to complete the book after Michelle had passed away?
Billy Jensen came in posthumously. He and Michelle had been acquainted, and they co-presented a panel at South by Southwest, and he lives part-time in Los Angeles, so they would get together periodically. But on the book, it was just me and Michelle. I was Michelle's researcher and her investigative partner, and then after Michelle passed, obviously there were a few days of distance. I didn't really reach out to anybody. I kind of just waited. It was an awful weekend immediately following her death. And then I had heard from Patton's assistant on Sunday. She advised me that Billy Jensen, whom I didn't know, had reached out and offered his services to help complete the book. Billy Jensen, his background, he's an investigative journalist. He has a long career in journalism as an editor and a digital media person. And he helped assemble the parts that Michelle had written for the book. There was really no structure to the book at that point because Michelle hadn't really fully considered it. I think for Michelle, really writing the book was secondary to investigating this case and attempting to identify this offender, and that writing the book gave her this kind of vehicle that legitimized her investment of time and resources and gave her closer access to case materials and personnel, investigators that had been working on this case. We had to kind of figure out after her death how she would have structured the book. She had submitted, I think, only 2 big chunks of writing to the publisher. So there were unfinished pieces and parts, and then pieces that maybe were first drafts for the LA Magazine piece that we went through, and Billy kind of worked on the chronology of it. Then writing the third part of the book, Billy and I co-authored it. My role in completion of the book, I worked closely with Jennifer Barth, who was the editor, and I, wrote the parts of the main text that were essential to the case that Michelle hadn't gotten around to writing. They're presented as editor's notes in the book, just photo clearance and photo captions. Billy created a Facebook page in an attempt to generate tips. And I think working on this case, there were 3 or 4 main avenues that Michelle and I felt were the most viable to identifying this perpetrator. For me, it was always the geography, the fact that this offender was active in 3 or 4 different geographic areas at distinct times, suggesting that he was living in these areas. And then the genealogy, the DNA, which by the time that Michelle and I were working on the case, I don't think we were aware of GEDmatch. I think it was after Michelle's passing that GEDmatch first entered the discussion. But, Michelle was using services such as YSearch and Ancestry.com that would essentially just spit back a list of possible surnames. We weren't looking at actual relatives at that point. And then, of course, the notion of a tip, somebody providing a tip that led to the perpetrator's identity. And then, of course, just re-examining the case files and looking for that piece of information, that clue, that person of interest that may have been overlooked or just missed at the time, that in hindsight has a different significance. So those are the 4 main avenues, and ultimately it was a forensic genealogy that led to this offender's identity. And Michelle was really excited about that avenue. Paul Holes obviously saw the value in it. He's a criminalist. He's a science person. And Bill Jensen, who's, I think, his wife is a neuroscientist, also saw the viability of that. Yeah, I know it was a long-winded answer.
I have to say that I really enjoyed how the book was laid out, because any parts that Michelle had started that you and Billy filled in, it was noted. So you knew that she had been working on this. She just hadn't quite finished it yet.
Right. And we wanted to make it very clear, what was her voice and what was not her voice. In some instances, like there was a chapter on Visalia, that was 50-50. A lot of that was my writing, and then her writing kind of merged together. She had written, I think, 2 or 3 different drafts on Visalia, and then there were unfinished paragraphs and notes with really flavorful passages, because Michelle was such an evocative writer. To even attempt to replicate her voice would have been a fool's errand.
Now, the book was published in February of 2018, and Joseph James D'Angelo was arrested in April.
That's right.
That's while you were in Chicago promoting the book with Patton and Billy. What was everyone's reaction when you heard the news?
So we were only there for about 24 hours. It was the first time all of Michelle's posthumous collaborators were together in one space. Patton, Gillian Flynn, who wrote the introduction, Billy, and myself. All 4 of us were unaware of any major development there had been. I had been kept fairly in the loop, but this was a development that materialized so quickly that there was so much clamoring to bring it into focus that I was just never apprised. So after the event, we all went back to our respective hotel rooms in downtown Chicago. I got a text about, 11 p.m. that night, Chicago time, from Mike Morford, who has a podcast called Criminology, and he's someone who's been closely following this case and involved with it. And he told me that he had heard from 2 different sources that an arrest had been made. But he was a bit skeptical, as was I, because I've heard things like this before. So my interest was piqued, but I wasn't terribly excited. I was also really eager to get some sleep because I don't sleep well, particularly when I have to be up at 5 in the morning or 4 in the morning to catch a 6 a.m. flight. So I hadn't slept the night before. I was running on fumes. And when I got back to my hotel room, I was looking forward to a night's sleep. And then this text comes in, and I was hoping in both directions that it was legitimate and finally this person had been arrested, but also that I would quickly learn it was bogus and I could sleep. As our interaction continued, it became increasingly apparent that this may well be legitimate, and this may well be the piece of news that we had been anticipating for the better part of a decade. And then about an hour after the initial text, I got another text from Morford in all caps telling me they got him. He's in custody. It's like, oh my God, another night's sleep lost. The only information he had at that point was that it was a 72-year-old former cop. So I immediately went to my lists of people that I'd been building over the last 8 years. I just couldn't find anyone that fit that description. I think I was able to manage 2 hours of sleep. I had texted Billy before I went to sleep with this news. He texted Patton, woke Patton up in the dead of night. That's the story, at least. I don't know why Patton would be sleeping with his phone on, not silenced. So the next morning I woke up and there it was all over the media. Joseph James D'Angelo. I'd never heard of the guy. His name never surfaced in any of my research travel. His name never came up in any of the case files that we had. I looked everywhere. I'd never come across this person. And indeed, his name never came up in any of the files in any of the jurisdictions in the 40 years that this case had been investigated that we know of. Been over a year since the arrest. We're still not aware of any instance of his name surfacing.
Wow.
So what was the first thing you guys talked about that morning? What did you do? What did you say?
Well, I had to catch a plane back to L.A., unfortunately. Billy and Patton were going to New York, so they did Good Morning America. I had people from various news organizations contacting me, mostly via Twitter. I think that's how I was most accessible at the time. Got back to LA and immediately I did a BBC radio interview, and then I appeared on HLN, and then Sunrise 7, it's an Australian breakfast show, at CNN International. It was just a surreal whirlwind of events. It's been a slow process of reconciling this person's name and face with the specter of this unidentified offender. Even to this day, I have a hard time reconciling Joseph D'Angelo with the Golden State Killer. You form your own image and your own notion of who this person is in a case where it's an unidentified offender. And after years and years and years, when this person's finally identified, it usually just doesn't quite neatly fit with your notion of who they are. And I was at a hearing last month in Sacramento. It was my first time being in the same room with this person. And he's lost a substantial amount of weight. He looks withered. He looks like a corpse. And I just looking at him standing in his cage the entire 3 minutes that he was in the courtroom, I couldn't reconcile the fact that this is the person responsible for this wave of mass panic that seized this entire region for like a 5-year period, changed the way people were living their lives. That's always the remarkable thing about these cases. It's just, it's like the man behind the curtain.
If you ever got the chance, what would be the first thing you would ask D'Angelo?
Oh my goodness. I've been asked that question so many times. I have a list of questions I would ask him. I can read some of them off if you like.
Oh, yes, please.
Go ahead.
All right. I'll try to speak quickly because I have a lot of them. Did you drop the homework evidence? Did you make any of the phone calls? Did you kill the Majoris, and why? What was your connection to each of the places in Southern California where you offended? Were there any rapes attributed to you for which you weren't responsible? Did you write that poem? Did you make the hang-up calls to prospective victims? Where are all the items that you stole? I think that would be my number one question. Did you ever drive your own car to a crime scene? What cars did you drive? Did you drive a white station wagon? That's the car that came up most frequently in the case file. Did you ever communicate with authorities or media in any way? Did you show up at any of the community meetings related to this case? I mean, that's only a small number of the questions that I would ask D'Angelo. And I don't think he would answer any of them. I don't think he's talking. I don't think he's ever going to talk.
Well, that's what I was going to say. From what I've heard, he's not talking.
I mean, he's literally not talking. He sits in the interrogation room in silence, motionless for hours, and they're unable to get anything out of this guy.
Well, he's a former cop. He knows not to say anything.
He knows to
and
keep his mouth shut.
That's why he was so hard to catch, I think. And I never would have identified him because my angle was the geography, cross-referencing various geographic databases. I could have been doing that for the next 20 years, and I don't think his name ever would have come up. There are a few different scenarios where it would have, but those are like so far out that I don't think I ever would have gotten to them. And I think it's only in hindsight, through this awareness of the fact that he was a cop, that, oh yeah, it makes sense that he wouldn't offend in his jurisdiction, that he would live in the next town, you know? I don't think it ever occurred to any of us. Maybe he wasn't even living in Sacramento during that period. I mean, yeah, it was a possibility that entered our minds, but it was one that we just dismissed because, you know, when you're investigating a case like this, you try to remain within the sphere of Occam's razor. Occam's razor, it turns out, didn't apply in this case.
Well, didn't Michelle predict that he would be someone who worked with law enforcement?
Yeah, that was something that she had considered. That's something that we all had considered. I think that Michelle had thought about him being maybe a security guard. Always a red flag when we would come upon a potential suspect if that person had been a security guard at some point or like a handyman. These are like among the most common professions for serial